going back to the 80s under Reagan and then really peaking towards the end of the 90s was this idea from especially those on the right to that public transit should be able to stand on its own feet. That if it's that important, why isn't it making a profit? As if anything that is important in our society must make a profit. And my point in the hearing was, the key word to me in public transportation is the word public. If you think about how we use that word, whether it be public libraries, public parks, public roads, those are things that we invest in as a community because it strengthens our community. And public transit is no different.
Yeah. Yeah, well, consider police and fire. Are we supposed to make money on police and fire? Yeah, there's a good example there. So, and I noticed this in your testimony, the Urban Institute report. They surveyed 151 major transit agencies, revealing that 90% experience either stagnant or reduced local funding. 89% saw similar trends in state funding. This goes back, about 14, 15 years. So as part of the Transportation Trades Department, I mean, you're obviously a collection of unions and all that. How do we get these local governments to say, wait a minute, you got to fund this animal here because people are relying on that? How do we do that, Greg?
Well, part of it is, we need strong federal support first. A lot of these are based on matching grants, so you have the federal government provides a certain amount of money and the local and state governments have to match it. If that matching money isn't available from the federal government, in most cases, local and state governments have much tighter budgets than the federal government does. So we need to have strong federal support across the board to provide the incentives for people to be able to invest. What happens is, especially when you have an economic downturn like we did during the pandemic or during the Great Recession, those local the tax revenue for local governments will dry up and it starts to become a lot tighter. As a result, their support for public transit systems can become lessened or weakened over time. And it creates what we call, the transit death spiral, because in order to meet budget gaps, they have to either reduce service or increase fares or both. And as a result of poorer service or higher fares, ridership goes down, which further decreases revenue, which means they have to go through that whole cycle again. And it just makes it, in many ways, for those who think public transit is a waste of money, it helps prove their point by saying, look, see, it's just getting worse. When in reality, the budget environment they're in is creating that environment, creating that problem in the first place.
Yeah. Sadly, there's a lot of people out there of the opinion figuring, well, if you're not making enough money, find a job that'll pay you better, and then you could buy a car and you don't have to worry about a bus or a train. And that attitude is so prevalent out there. One more question on this, though. You mentioned federal matching funds. With this committee, it sounded like you got a lot of good participation, especially among conservatives. Do you think they might move the needle in that direction, maybe kind of help out these state and local governments?
I think so. And, this is important because we have a big reauthorization coming up at the end of next year for all of our surface transportation programs, which includes public transit. And we've done it before is the other important part. During the pandemic, we allowed these transit systems to use federal funds for operating costs, for their overall operating costs. So we've shown that what this can do when the federal government provides this flexibility to transit agencies, that it can keep these critical services going during difficult financial times. And if you think about systems like New York or DC or even, Toledo, Ohio, and smaller places, a lot of the folks that needed to use those transit services were the folks that were keeping our country going, whether it be doctors and nurses or grocery store workers or anybody who could not work from home but were vital to keeping people fed and healthy. They needed those services. So when we allowed transit agencies to use this money, this federal support for operations, it allowed those systems to keep going and providing that vital public good during a crisis time. So we've seen what it can do. And I think that as we go into the next reauthorization, we start rethinking how we fund and the way we fund transit programs. These type of examples and this type of support from the right should offer a pretty good springboard for us to be able to try to change the law and get real support for operating funding in the next bill.
Yeah, we'll keep our fingers crossed on that one.